So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It's the protection of a fundamental human right.
Hello, and welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, the podcast where we talk justice over coffee with a special guest. And this week's guest is Californian filmmaker and campaigner Barak Laub. Barak and his buddy made a documentary called Volunteers Needed, warning people to the unforeseen risks of voluntourism and the prevalence of orphanage trafficking. Wait, you said that wrong, haven't you? Don't you mean orphan trafficking? The trafficking of orphans? No, I don't, actually. I mean the bogus orphanages trafficking in children, like zoo animals at a petting zoo, to be temporarily helped, in inverted commas, by well-meaning Western travellers passing through. What? Indeed. He's a super interesting guy and has so much to say that people need to hear, so tune into this one. But before we get into this, a word from our sponsor. The world is constantly changing, is it not? With new threats emerging every time we turn on the TV or scroll through social media. How many of these do we actually need to stay alert to, and how much of this is just white noise? If you're a risk manager, you need to be able to discern what will and what won't have a dynamic impact on your business. Need a little help with that? Why not speak to one of our consultants at Oakwood Risk Group, or check out some of our online courses. Go to oakwoodriskgroup.com. And now to the episode. Hey Barak, welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, my friend. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Oh no, my pleasure. So we always start by talking coffee, but you've made a quick reference to an energy drink just prior to recording. So what's all that about? Are you not a big coffee man?
I am a big coffee guy, actually. I'm also drinking coffee at the same time. The problem I have is I think I like coffee too much. I just really like the taste of coffee, the sort of bitterness. So as of like 2 weeks ago, it wasn't uncommon for me to drink like 8 or 9 cups of coffee in a day. I'd make a French press in the morning, and I might have a large like decaf Americano or a large Americano with like 4 shots, and then in the afternoon I might have, a decaf or something, or I could just keep drinking, and then of course potentially like espresso after a meal. And I was having tummy problems. And, I thought, maybe I should go back from what I was doing of just drinking coffee all day and none of this water stuff, and limit myself to 1, maybe 2 cups of coffee maximum. Maybe have like 1 energy drink, or I've been drinking more green tea in the morning because, the first thing I would do, I would wake up and I would make coffee, and then I wouldn't brush my teeth until I'd finished the French press. And then once I'd finished that French press, then I would brush my teeth, potentially make another one so my wife could have some, and get my day started. So I've been cutting back a little bit, but I am a big coffee guy.
Oh, mate, I'm so pleased to hear this. I've never actually seen anyone chase coffee with an energy drink. That's really impressive. I have the same tummy trouble. I actually have to take lansoprazole because I've given myself such terrible indigestion. I wonder how much of that is a consequence of lining my belly with a sort of lightly acidic drink every morning for the last 20 odd years.
Yeah, and the other thing is I love spicy food. So it's like I'm drinking coffee all the time, and then I'm in California, so if I get Mexican food, I'm putting on all of the salsas and the hot sauces, and like I'll put hot sauce on my spaghetti, on my pizza, I put on tapatio, which my wife doesn't get. So I realized that maybe I may be overdoing these 2 things. So occasionally I'll drink, and the energy drinks I drink aren't like Red Bull or Monster with the 300 milligrams of caffeine. They usually have like 80 milligrams of caffeine from green tea, and they're kind of sweet. So it's just like a second cup of coffee. But I use this as an example, like if I really like beer as well, like hazy IPAs. And if I'm out and I'm drinking hazy IPAs and they're good, I can just drink them the whole day. I could have like 5 or 6. And I don't really like light beers and lagers. So like let's say a Pacifico, I'll probably just have 1. So if I keep going with the coffee, I'll just drink it all day. So the same thing, I'll have the coffee, and then I'll have the 1 sort of energy drink, and then I'm good for the rest of the day. There's no more continuing it on.
You must be a hard worker. I know prior to this recording we talked, and you've got young kids, right? Is that part of the motivation?
Yeah, so I've got a 3.5-month-old baby, a little girl, and that really made me start thinking about my health. So I like to go mountain biking. It's probably my favorite outdoor activity. I also trail run, and I met my wife rock climbing, but mountain biking is like the bee's knees. And I was going every Sunday, and I'd go with my friends. And one of my friends who has kids, and this is before I had a baby, says to me, Barak, like, I love hanging out with you. I love going mountain biking. But every time we go mountain biking, which is supposed to be healthy, we go and get burritos and beer, like, right after. And I need to watch my cholesterol. And I said, Dylan, what the F are you talking about? Look at us. We look great. I don't have to worry about cholesterol. And recently, like, shortly before my daughter was born, I was on a search and rescue mission. So it's where you go out and you look for people who are trapped or had a problem. And a guy had passed away hiking on a lot of the trails that I do pretty regularly. And usually when someone passes away, they're older. They're like this 80-year-old rock star who's out there doing the trails all the time, and they just did it one time too many. And that wasn't the case. And so I said, well, how old was this guy? And they said he was, was in his early 40s. And I said, well, what kind of shape was he in? Was he really out of shape and he shouldn't have been out there because some of these trails are tough? And they said, no, he's a hiker and a trail runner, and he's out all the time. And I thought, okay, I need to get my cholesterol checked. So I got like my first doctor's visit in forever, and I did the full panel, and I just read a book called Outlive by Dr. Attia, and I'm like taking vitamin D. So I'm in that like health journey now that I have a daughter, that I'm like, okay, I need to start thinking about how I'm taking care of myself, because I'm not invincible and I want to be there for her as she grows up. So that's been a bit of a change.
I can understand why people in the UK would take vitamin D, because naturally you get it through the sun, which we have very little of. But being Californian, I'm amazed that that's what you've been prescribed. This is the point where I'm sure the listeners are thrilled to hear about the positive influence of vitamin D on the modern man. But what I really want to talk to you about is this amazing documentary you made. But maybe we'll start before that, actually, if you don't mind. Maybe we'll go back to the fact that today, as I talk to you, you're an active campaigner on this particular social issue, the issue of orphanage trafficking, which we're going to cover in this episode. But for somebody to take this on, to someone to stop and lean in when they see something that seems unusual or unjust, that takes a certain type of character, right? So have you any idea where that comes from in your own life?
Yeah, I think it was largely example set by my parents. My dad did something. My dad was an orphan, so this issue is fairly close to me, but he didn't have a bike when he was a kid. And when I was growing up, he had this program where he would go around picking up people to old, used, unwanted bikes, especially kids' bikes, and he would fix them up, and then every Christmas and Thanksgiving, he would give them away at these kind of like community dinners. And you'd see these kids who couldn't afford bikes get them. And that put a large sort of stint in me and the idea of giving back. And I've always wanted to volunteer and believed in volunteering, and it's something I pretty much constantly do. So before I was on the search and rescue team, I was a volunteer with CASA, which is in the United States, it's a court-appointed special advocate. And what they do is they make sure that foster youth have someone who's on their side when they go to court. And so I did that for a bit. And before I did that, I had volunteered when I lived in New York. I taught art in inner city schools. I just always believed in that aspect that we should be giving back and contributing. So even though I'm still doing other projects and other volunteer things, I feel like this is something that it's important that I stick with and I continue. I'm sure you've heard the saying that if your only tool is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And so to me, this is so crazy that this issue, which you know about, is orphanage tourism and how it leads to child trafficking. That essentially there's like 8 million kids living in orphanages, and 80% of them, so over 6 million, aren't actually orphans. They have families and homes they could go back to. And that's just legal and happening, and it's being caused by volunteers and donations from the US and the UK. Someone needs to do something about it and try and say something about it. And having become so close to it and sort of become a de facto expert from a filmmaker to an advocate, it just seemed like I should be that person.
Yeah, amazing. You mentioned how passionate you are as a volunteer, right? And somehow, despite that, you're now recognizing the issue of where voluntourism can be problematic. Like, stitch those two things together. Give me the highlight tour of how you've come almost full circle.
Yeah, so volunteering is a good thing. I would recommend that everybody volunteer in some way. And to me, what volunteering is you do something you're not obligated to do to help make the world a better place. So a very simple example of volunteering that is not controversial and isn't going to win you any, bonus points is if you go on a walk, let's say I'm walking my dog, if I use his poop bags and I pick up the garbage on the side of the road, right? That's a little thing I can do that no one's going to know about unless I talk about it on a podcast. That makes the world a better place. And then there's kind of organized volunteering along the same level. You could do in California, it's very common. We have a great organization called Surf Rider that gets people together and they go out and they pick up all the trash and the things on beaches. What both of these things have in common is I'm not paying to do them, and anybody is qualified to go around and pick up trash. What voluntourism has started to become is where people turn volunteering into part of a tourist experience. And often that includes them paying for that opportunity. And the issue here is if you're paying for the opportunity to volunteer, you're not really volunteering, you're buying an experience, right? So if you pay to have a voluntourism experience, it's really not that different than if you pay to go like whitewater rafting. You're paying to be able to do something cool in order to tell people about it. And you're not usually an incredibly qualified person doing that. If you're a doctor volunteering with Doctors Without Borders, you're not going to pay for it. If you're not a qualified doctor and you're in medical school and you want to go practice medicine without a license in a foreign country and pad your CV, that is unfortunately something you can pay for. And I think there's a pretty drastic difference between the outcomes of those two things.
Yeah. And so how did you first recognize what you now describe as voluntourism?
I think it was a gradual process. When we first started this film, it wasn't about orphanage tourism. It wasn't about child trafficking. It was about me and my best friend going to Asia to explore and have a good time and ride on motorcycles and try interesting foods and stay in monasteries and talk about religion and all that fun stuff. The idea of volunteering was just going to be a side note that, oh, hey, if you're in this village, you can volunteer at this school, or you can help reforest this forest, and that sort of thing. And like I said, I like to volunteer, so I wanted to show these opportunities that people could do where they wouldn't have to pay money. And my thought was, some of these places that do need volunteers, they'll need volunteers for longer times than 1 week, but they don't have the ability to advertise that they're looking for volunteers, that they're looking for help, these small villages in India and Nepal. And while we were filming, we talked to this woman who had this story where she had paid money from Australia to volunteer in an orphanage, and then it turned out that while she was there, the orphanage director was arrested for child trafficking, and the kids weren't orphans, and they wanted to go home, and it's illegal to volunteer in Nepal without a special kind of visa, which of course she didn't have because no one makes you get it because they're all just interested in getting your money. And my initial thought was like, yeah, you chose the wrong orphanage. I understand you paid an Australian organization to make that choice for you, but there's hundreds of orphanages here. Look, they're all around, and you chose the one bad one. And as we started changing the focus and, delving more into this topic, because it was super interesting, the idea of an orphanage trafficking kids in order to get donations was like, what? It blew my mind. So we started learning more about it. And that's when we started to understand that this isn't like one bad orphanage. This is systemic in the entire industry. And as something I like to mention to people the first time they hear about it, because in the West, in the United States at least, we still kind of have this perception that like orphanages are the highest good. Helping the orphan is the best thing you can do. And something I always like to say is, well, why don't we have orphanages in the U.S.? Why don't we have them in the U.K.? Why aren't they in Ireland? Why aren't they in Finland? Why aren't they in France? And they say, oh, because we have foster care here. I'm like, yeah, well, why is that? And that's because every study ever done has found that the institutionalization of children is harmful. It's kind of should be reserved as like you have a kid and he's really misbehaving. I don't mean like he's shoplifting, but he is, the danger of harming others, and then we can kind of go the juvie route. But otherwise, it hurts the outcome of these children. It hurts their development. It hurts their reintegration into society. It makes it so they'll have lower incomes, and just everything is bad across the board. So all of these kind of first world countries, this global north, have moved towards the foster care system, the kinship system, family-based care. And they have their problems. As someone who's, volunteered inside of the foster care system, I've seen some of them firsthand. That being said, as someone who's also been inside the institutionalization of children, and especially in orphanages, I can tell you the problems in the foster care system aren't as bad as the ones in the orphanage care system. So that was kind of the first big awakening. And then the question is, why then does this exist? Why don't they have family-based care or kinship-based care, which is actually how things used to be before colonization, right? So throughout Africa, throughout Asia, if something happened to the parents, usually, it was the aunts, the uncles, the cousins who looked after the children. And I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who's from the Philippines, and he became a successful businessman. And, he was asking about my film. He says, but I want to start an orphanage. I want to help kids. And I said, if your parents died when you were a kid in the Phils, would you have gone to an orphanage? He goes, oh, no, of course not. I said, who would have looked after you? He's like, my aunts or my cousins. I'm like, that's exactly how it is everywhere in the world. The reason these orphanages still exist is because of the amount of money which is flowing in from volunteers, from donors, from mission trips, that it makes economic sense for someone to gather these children together away from their families and put them in an orphanage. And keep in mind, once again, that 80% of the children in these orphanages have families they could go back to. A common thing I get from people is, there's poverty, they're poor, so this is helping keeping the kids from starving. Well, just from the economic side of it, for every one child that is paid for to be inside of an institution like an orphanage or a child care home, that could help benefit 5 to 10 children. So if your organization is donating enough money to help 1,000 children in, orphanages, that same money could help 5,000 children by working in a better scheme like reintegration and transitions, helping alleviate that poverty, right? And I think that's something too that's really important. In my work and my advocacy, I'm not trying to make orphanages illegal. A lot of people I talk to who work in the field, who do this, every day, day in, day out, want to see orphanages eventually abolished. I think that's a huge step, but I think that every orphanage needs to have some basic foundations that are required. So at a minimum, if they're taking volunteers or putting those volunteers with vulnerable children, they need to do background checks. And there's numerous cases in the United States where convicted child sex predators have paid money to either go with an organization like IVHQ or an international volunteer organization, or have gone through their churches in order to volunteer with vulnerable children. And that's totally legal. There's nothing illegal about taking money and taking a sex offender and putting him with vulnerable kids in another country, as long as you don't know he has the intent to do something wrong. And that's bogus. That needs to stop. And the second thing is, these organizations, they're obviously regulated by their own country. Some operate here, but many don't do audits of the children, right? So there's no overarching rule like, okay, you have 40 kids, we need all of their names, their social security numbers, and we want to track them for 10 years to see where they're going. So some of these kids are sold off. It becomes a nexus for other places because they actually do have a family, they have somewhere they could go, but then they have someone else who has an economic incentive who's in charge of their future, and he can kind of do what he wants with those kids, which to me is crazy. And I'd like to see some regulations around there, at least around from the US side, that if you're taking money from US citizens and sending it to, someone who's controlling vulnerable children, that you're not facilitating, child trafficking into the more severe forms of human trafficking. Then the third one is they should have a reintegration and a transition program. So we all know family-based care is the best form. And I think people do make the argument, it's the strongest one I've heard of, well, there's always some example someone has about why their orphanage is the one good one. These kids have a learning disorder, and from the village they come in Africa, they just kill kids with that disorder. I've heard that. I've never actually seen that be the accurate case, but I've heard those kinds of stories. these kids are all rescued from the sex trafficking and they can't go home and they end up in these orphanages and they have nowhere else to go. Those sort of arguments. And even if they meet those other two things that I required at the beginning, they should have some sort of reintegration or transition program. The institutionalization of individuals can't be the end goal. It can't be like, okay, we're going to get money and we're going to use that money to fund ourselves and to fund you, and then once you're 18, you're out. There needs to be some sort of transition program for the betterment of these kids. And then the fourth thing I'm working for is to get orphanage trafficking recognized in the United States as a severe form of human trafficking. So we have these three sort of severe forms of human trafficking: sex trafficking, forced labor, and child soldiers. And the other forced trafficking, or the other forms of trafficking, aren't considered severe, and so they're not as regulated by the TVPRA, which is the overarching mechanism, so kind of looking at these traffickings going on. And what is so dangerous about the orphanage trafficking is it is like a nexus, and that the people who are trafficked can be trafficked from there into further places, and they're not being watched as carefully, and they may not have the parents able to say, hey, someone took my kid, or this is what's going on, to report it.
You just stop there. Mate, that was brilliant. I wasn't ready for you to stop, but that was brilliant. So there's a lot there, okay? Starting in Tibet. So you've given me what's wrong, you've given me the issue, and you've given me a strategy forward that involves regulation, reintegration, etc. But I want to kind of at least take a step or two back to you being on your motorbike with your best pal in Tibet and stumbling across this and deciding...
So we were in
Sorry. Sorry.
We didn't cross into China.
Nepal.
We did go up Kardang La, which is the highest motorable road in the world, and kind of could have gotten us to connect over, but we never actually made it to Tibet.
Okay, sorry, Nepal. Yes, Nepal. And then the documentary took a change, or what was maybe going to be a fun thing turned into something a little bit more serious, and now you've turned into a very knowledgeable individual on this subject matter. And so tell me about some of the discoveries. And now this is, so you've discussed this as if it's an international thing as opposed to a domestic thing to the country of Nepal, but that's where your learning began, right? So just explain that.
This is an international issue. This isn't a Nepal issue. And I've seen, cases where I've talked to people personally and they said, oh, wow, I was going to volunteer in an orphanage in Nepal. I'm so glad you told me this. I'll go volunteer in another orphanage. And I'm like, no, these other orphanages aren't better. I'm just I had all the time in Nepal because that's where we were based. But anyone you talk to at any major organization was like, this is an issue everywhere. And then these people post on Facebook their photos helping cute little African children in Tanzania. And I'm just going, man, you're contributing to the problem. So I really want to make it clear. Nepal is not the place that has this issue. What almost everywhere has in common is poverty and usually war or mass death, right? So how this issue started in Nepal was there was a war. There was a Maoist revolution, and the Maoists were going around the countryside, and families were getting caught up in it, and children were being drafted. And so at that point in time, the center of the royal government was in Kathmandu. There was still members of the royal family alive and in charge. And there was this belief that if I sent my child to Kathmandu and put them in an orphanage or in a private school, they would be safe. The Maoists couldn't draft them. The war would be over. The kids could come home. What started happening almost initially is well-meaning people wanted to adopt these kids, and then these kids were being adopted internationally. I actually know a girl here where I live who she has a family who was alive in Nepal, and she was adopted out of Kathmandu, and she wasn't comfortable to tell her adoptive family for years that her family was still alive. I met her after the documentary, but that was a widespread issue, and now you can't actually adopt children from Nepal, and that's been since 2009. But these people still needed to make money. And so they found, we can get volunteers to come here, and we can get donors, and we can find private funds and get people to help pay for, these children's programs, and you can adopt a child or, foster a child from abroad and give a certain amount of money a month. And so that became a huge revenue stream. This happened because of the AIDS crisis. This happened in Rwanda after the ethnic cleansing. This is happening in places like Ukraine where they're being bombed in their village. And it's like, hey, you have your cute little baby or your young children at home where you're constantly at risk and they're bombing maternity hospitals and children's hospitals. you might be able to get them into an orphanage in Poland or get them into somewhere in Poland. And people are willing to sign documents saying, yeah, the kid's an orphan, but keep track of them, let me get them back. And then once they're there, they can be transported off to wherever. So this is very much a global issue. The documentary focuses on Nepal because, it was completely self-funded. It was originally me and my best friend doing a motorcycle trip, and we were in India and Nepal at the time.
What were you riding?
We were riding Enfields.
Yeah. British bike.
Yeah, and what's really cool is, and maybe it's not cool from your perspective, but India hasn't evolved its environmental standards along with the UK and America.
Oh yeah, I love that. That's really cool.
When you buy a Royal Enfield 350 Bullet, it is the same bike that it was in 1959. So you're riding this 350 Thumper where your air filter falls off. It still has a classic British engineering, so they kept that. But your air filter falls off and it's just vibrating the whole time, and anyone can fix it, right? So that was what was so cool.
That sounds like a lot of fun. As an aside, I've just completely changed my motorcycle. I've now got a GS. I've been watching the latest Long Way Home this time, right? Long way down, long way around, long way home. And I was like, it's time I got something a bit more comfortable to ride. So I'm ready for another adventure. One of the things that I liked about your interviews is one of the people, I think one of the volunteers you interviewed said that it just seems strange that people who are orphaned, or the number of orphans globally are dropping, but the number of orphanages are increasing. You think, oh, okay, yeah, that's a pretty unusual dichotomy of circumstance. Like you mentioned, there's a certain degree of nuance here. You've got to allow for exceptional cases. There will be, certainly in the industry that Blue Bear, my organisation's invested it is in, and protecting, restoring and equipping children and young people whose lives have been impacted by human trafficking, more specifically sex trafficking. And in many cases of the children whose lives were invested in, their parents were either responsible for their exploitation or absent, and family members are untraceable and whatnot. And fantastic examples of rehabilitation centres and investment in education, employment skills, and etc. etc. It's balancing that against what is quite clearly a nefarious organised criminal industry that has been created to bring in well-intended, well-meaning individuals who want to do a bit of travelling, help some kids, get a couple of good photos for Instagram, move on to the next country. Let's do the salt flats in Bolivia or Machu Picchu in Peru or whatever, and tick that long traveller list that some of us have been privileged enough to experience. How do you distinguish those two without potentially being too binary and throwing the baby out with the bath water is my question. Or do you think you have to be particularly binary and robust with this issue?
No, I do. I don't think this is a binary issue. I think this is super complicated. And, one of the things we talked about in doing this documentary is there's all these people who have good intentions and good motives, and they're trying to help, and they're putting in thousands of dollars of their own money and months of their own time, ostensibly doing something less fun and exciting than we were doing, riding around motorcycles, exploring the Asian subcontinent. How do we make sure we don't do the same thing with the documentary? How do we make sure that we don't have a message that ends up causing larger harm? And that's something we're super interested in, and I wanted to cover in the documentary as well. I mentioned this to you before, but one of the things that got me really interested in this before I went to college, the first time I went to India, is you meet a lot of these kind of hippies who go to India to do yoga and, get in practice with their karma. And a lot of these hippies like to smoke weed. And in Nepal and India, the best weed is called Manali cream. And it's a kind of handmade hash where you go around and you rub your hands on the plant. And in order to do it, you need a really high quality grade of marijuana plant, and you need really soft hands. And a normal tola of charas of this kind of weed might cost $1, but Manali cream may cost $30 or $40. So the only people who can really afford it are the Westerners who are coming there trying to do good practices. And what none of them ever seem to realize is if you need soft hands, there's only one group of people who have soft hands in India, and that's children. And so they're kind of enforcing this happen, right? So how do you avoid these sort of negative externalities when you're doing something that you're not contributing to harming the people you want to help? And that's why I think with these 4 things I'm pushing, these four legislative actions that I think could be applied anywhere in any country, it's not going to stop any good organization. Any good organization, which really is trying their darndest, if they're not doing these already, they should say, hey, that's a great idea, right? If there's a guy who runs an orphanage and he really is trying to help kids, and he didn't know that there were background checks that could be done in the United States to help vet and keep sex predators from coming to his orphanage, he should say, yeah, they should do that, right? If he's not already doing an audit to see where these children are going and what their outcomes are and, where the money's happening, he should say, what a great idea, I should be doing an audit. So these are things that I think are standards. And the issue, right, is with the standard, people just kind of raise to the very bottom minimum standard of what's legally available. And if we don't have standards, we're going to have things which are far more nefarious and far worse. So raising standards on places that already exist, I think, is a very good thing.
Yeah, 100%. And the danger, of course, is when we hand over the responsibility of regulation to government agencies, depending on, of course, what country you're operating in. Is that going to be sufficient to give you what you hope is going to be that nice green tree label in the corner, or helping hands label, or something that's going to suggest that this place has got the rubber stamp, some bloke's been there with a clipboard and given them a once over, and okay, I'm safe to go and volunteer. It's dangerous, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of greenwashing that happens in the coffee industry, in the label industry, in the food industry. But as I mentioned before, it's all the minimum standard. So I don't know if you've heard of this book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. He was an author in the United States. And he wrote this book, I want to say, back in like the 30s. And it was all about how immigrants were being abused in the United States, who were coming here and kind of forced to work in like the meat and the labor plants. And they would get these terrible homes and horrible loans and kept in poverty. And it talked about the terrible standards in the meat packing plants, that rats were mixed in with beef and cows would be dead for days, and these poor immigrants were doing it. And it changed no laws about the immigrant treatment, but it changed a lot of laws about the meat industry. And he used to say that he aimed for America's heart and he hit them in the stomach. But before those laws got passed, that was still happening. They were putting rat inside of beef, and that was legal, right? And so it does take those legal standards. And I think it's kind of an unfortunate reality that if you don't have a government making rules and requirements, people are going to do it. People had slaves in the United States until the government said, no, this is absolutely illegal. And then Texas kept them until they actually marched in and made them stop, right? And it's like people are going to use slavery if it's legal and they can get away with it. People are going to do these donations, or they're going to transfer money, even if it hurts children, if they can make money out of it. And there's not any sort of repercussion. Something that's happened in the United States is people have actually sued organizations where they've donated money to, and they've gone over and found out they were contributing to child trafficking. And the U.S. court has ruled that they didn't have standing to sue. That facilitating child trafficking in foreign countries, that's an issue over there. That requires that country to act about it. And these countries have rules on the books. This stuff that was happening in Nepal is illegal in Nepal. But if you look at the wealth discrepancy that a lot of people don't really identify and look at. But for example, when we were in Nepal, a laborer, a guy working in the field all day, could make $2 to $3 for his sort of hard work. If you spoke really good English and you were able to work as like a waiter, you might make $5 a day. A teacher would make $100 a month. And a teacher in Nepal, like in the United States, they require a degree and accreditation in order to go and teach in a school. They have to spend that time investing in themselves. At the same time, you have people who spend $100 a day, and they consider it a bargain because they get, food and accommodation and transportation. And when you have that level of wealth discrepancy, right? Like if you're paying in a day what a cop is going to make in a month, and there's 4 or 5 people just like you, that's a lot of money to bribe cops and legislative officials. And so even though they have laws on the books, it's incredibly hard to enforce when you have the equivalent of, multi-millionaires coming over and dropping money to do these things that are in violation of their laws.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was thinking when you mentioned the book The Jungle of a couple of books that I read, because I'm obviously a humanitarian, right? I run a charity, and I'm constantly examining whether what we're doing is the right thing, if there's anything unintended or not that could potentially be long-term unhelpful or harmful or whatever, because we tend to make these mistakes, and if we don't learn from them, we will repeat them and whatnot. And I want to be at the forefront of doing things that are proven to be genuinely, transformational in a positive light. So we've got to stay open. We've got to try not to be defensive, and we've got to learn. And what's referred to as victim informed care is a big development in recent decades. But maybe we should actually listen to people referred to as survivors rather than victims. And what do they want as a consequence of this case? What do they want as a consequence of this injustice pressed upon them? Actually, maybe the criminal penal consequences, as important as they may be, aren't quite up there with the desire to be taken home safely, to be financially remunerated for some of their experience, all of those sort of things. So that, I think we're all on that journey. I think we're constantly learning lessons, and I'm hopefully really open to those. And I read a book. Neither of these books are particularly new, certainly not as old as the one you referenced, but they're not particularly new. One is Where Helping Hurts. I don't know if you've read that. Steve Corbett, Bryn, Fikkert. I found that really hard. Read. It's just like, oh gosh, it seems to be describing all of my best intentions as evil or foolish. The other is Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. That was particularly brilliant. I thought it really described how generations of pouring money, more specifically into Africa, in the form of aid, has really not helped the countries in an economic way. Well, she's an economist, but it really powerful. So we're all on a journey regarding that. One of the things I wanted to almost suggest, if you were in a room with young people, I often have young people volunteer with us, or maybe seek some advice. I'm really keen to do some traveling. I'd love to get involved in working with children around the world, living in poverty or experiencing inequality. And I'm trying to signpost them to trustworthy, good organizations for which they can lend their support. Like, how would you answer that question if someone came to you and it's like, hey, I listened to your podcast with Bryn. Like, how do I go out, do something with my gap year that's going to be great, help people, but not, so into a really unhelpful model?
So I think there's a couple important things there. The first is kind of going back to what I was saying before, is what is your qualification to do that thing? Are you qualified to do that thing in the United States or the United Kingdom? Because if you're not, then you're probably not qualified to do it somewhere else. And people will think, oh, I can teach English anywhere. Like, I can just take this thing, even though I was a terrible student. I have the ability to go and work with these vulnerable kids and not know anything about their culture. The other thing that I think is really important is that if you're going to a foreign country or a foreign place, your goal shouldn't be to teach others or to help others. It should be to learn about that place and that culture.
So good.
It's kind of, if you think about it, right? Like if you're even like a professional chef in the United States, and you wanted to develop your chef set and help, you wouldn't like go to Japan or France and try and teach them your groundbreaking culinary techniques. You would go there and you would learn what they were doing, and you would integrate that into your own stuff, and maybe eventually it would trickle back down through that sort of expertise. That being said, if someone really did want to make a difference and they really did want to help and they wanted to use their gap year in a productive way, the first thing is they shouldn't be paying anyone in order to help, because once again, then you're buying a volunteer experience. But they should find something they might be qualified to do, and then they should be there for a long period of time. Like 3 months is short, probably 6 months is a good minimum. And then they actually have the ability, and they can take that knowledge and integrate it in the future. So let's say they said, oh, I really want to go I want to go help vulnerable children in Africa, in Kenya or something like that. Well, they shouldn't be working directly with the children unless they're like a certified social care worker or something like that. They should be working with an organization, and then they should be finding out what the core issues are. Why are these children ending up in these homes? What's happening with the money? Where is it going? And over a longer period of time, they may actually have a positive benefit. One of the few people who we met who I could tell really made a difference was this girl named Rochelle from California, and she worked for a nonprofit in the United States in the green sector, trying to help get certification and raise funds and protect lands and all that stuff. And so she contacted a similar organization in Nepal and said, hey, I want to come to Nepal for, 3 months on a visa, and I want to volunteer with you guys working in your office, etc. And they said, sure, great. And they helped her get an apartment, somewhere for like $100 a month, and it was really nice. And then she taught them, she didn't work with the end beneficiaries. She worked with the organization to teach them how to apply for U.S. grants. She taught them some new tools and tricks in Excel and the Google Suite. And she had an actual impact on that organization using her skill set. And of all of the people I saw in Nepal who volunteered, she probably was one of the very, very few who actually had a net positive in what they did. So if you want to, if that's really your thing, if you're like, oh man, I really want to go help the orangutans, I love orangutans, I've always liked them, you're going to be able to pay someone to fly over to Indonesia and get your hands on a baby orangutan and feed it a bottle, but then you're not helping, you're just paying money to use orangutans as a petting zoo. You could get involved in some sort of organization and research, and if you were qualified to do something, you could go over there, learn an absolute ton, come back, get a PhD in orangutan something, and then continue to make a difference as you got older. And that's really the way if you wanted to make a change to do it. That being said, there's nothing wrong with being an ethical tourist, right? If I said this to you and you said, well, that sounds like a lot of work, I just want to go to India and eat cool food and travel around and go to, monasteries and Hindu temples, like that's totally fine. If you're going there, you're spending your money in a good place, you're contributing to the economy, you're learning, that's a great thing. As long as you're not causing these sort of negative externalities, riding abused elephants because it's a cool photo op, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's trying to, because giving to charities that are a better place, that employ local domestic people who speak their own language, know their culture, are suitably qualified and experienced to perform the functions, rather than, hey, I'll come and help build your house. Any building quals? No, but how can it be? It's far more beneficial. I can completely understand to follow a model like that. But I'm more.
There are I've seen some cool schemes, right, where people go over and it's like they donate a ton of money and then they get to do some minor stuff, but it employs the local artisans to do it, right? And so then they get the experience, they get to help build the school or the house, but they're really just handing bricks, right? They shouldn't be doing anything more than a hammer and a nail, but they've employed an entire network of people. And there are some, Kids of Kathmandu is a great one, where they've realized too, it's unfortunate about human nature, is we want to put our hands on things, right? There are so many well-meaning people who are willing to spend $3,000 to go over and teach English for 2 weeks or a month, but that same $3,000 could hire a high-qualified teacher for 3 years. And right. No one's willing to do that. But a lot of people are willing to go and do their kind of 2 weeks of expertise. So I have seen some schemes where they say, okay, we're going to take, let's say unqualified people who are going to make large donations, and they can kind of learn from the artisans and see what's going on and help employ these people, and it's been done sort of equitably. But there's obviously a huge gray area. And one of the important things to realize is that, almost nobody is qualified to know when something is a scam or not. You might consider yourself really savvy in this, but, you've only had a week or two to figure out if there's something bad going on in a level that you don't have expertise. And that other guy has his entire career to fool people. I had a personal example where there was this guy who I had met in Nepal, and I thought he was really great and he was really helping, and he had all these sort of charitable organizations, etc. And I'd met him before, and I came back, and then he also owned a dance bar, which is where girls, it's kind of their equivalent of a strip club, and it becomes a nexus to prostitution. And we started having this conversation because this is a guy I'd met, I'd talked to, I liked, we got along, I had dinner, all that stuff. And I'm going, should the guy who runs an orphanage also run the equivalent of a strip club? Is that, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't sit right. And, I would consider myself very savvy. And it kind of takes this, seeing the things. And he could have very easily not have told me he had the dance bar. And I could have kept going on in this ignorance. And so it's a lot of people we've talked to really thought they were doing good. And what's so, I think, interesting about the documentary is we were there for so long. We got to see people go from this, oh, I could see why this is bad, but I'm in one of the good ones, to, yeah, why am I changing 8-year-old girls' clothes and giving them baths? And how come I haven't seen a social worker? And how come I paid thousands of dollars and they don't have hot water? And how come the owner of the orphanage has 3 motorcycles? You know, and this sort of opens up. And even one of these people, she goes back because her neighbor is the one who told her about this orphanage. And she goes back and she says, hey, this is actually nefarious. Like, these girls are, you know, kind of not forced, but encouraged to do these like dance troupes, which is sort of exploitative, and you know, it's not tracking where they're going, and some of them have families, and I don't think we should be giving money. And the neighbor says, like, you know, you have no idea what you're talking about. This guy is a saint. He would never do anything wrong. You know, I'm not going to fund anything that you have to say. I'm not going to listen to it. And I'm ashamed that you would even say this to me about this hero, right? And that's the thing. Like, some of these people who aren't in the best interest of the children have done a really good job turning themselves into this sort of Mother Teresa figure who's really helping others. And then it's very hard to realize that you've been contributing to the trafficking of children and the harm of people. It's a lot easier to kind of be in denial and have that cognitive dissonance.
One of the guys you interviewed, I won't say his, but anyone who watched just the documentary will clock him. He definitely set off some alarm bells to me. It's like, yeah, I really like young kids. I really like working with young kids. And then later on, he came up and said something like, you know, I don't think it went past the line of physical abuse, but I definitely saw some physical punishment going on. I mean, it's sort of, you say potato, I say potato. I'm like, dude, what? But yeah, that,
you know, there are major cultural differences, you know, and that's one of the things that most people who go don't understand.
That guy was Canadian.
Yeah.
He's like, well, I'm not sure it passed the line of...
He was one of the people who, you know, I want to say, like, when he went, it was still the perfect orphanage, right? And we kind of talked to him at the beginning, and then after he had been there for a couple months, and he was one of the, I would say, better volunteers that we interviewed. He actually had a working with children's check and stuff like that. That being said, it wasn't until after we started talking, and you can see it, you know, and you don't realize this necessarily in the documentary. It could be in the same interview or a day later, but this was probably like 4 months or 3 months after, and we started asking questions like, have you ever asked where your money went or seen an audit? And then he starts saying, no. Yeah, I should do that. You know, and this is the thing, right? You go in this with this naivety, and the guy who's running the orphanage, his job is to teach you that you're a hero, and the children give you garlands, and everyone tells you how much they love you. You know, and then I think one of the things that what actually started to be alarming for him wasn't, you know, because once again, you know, Nepal is a very different country, right? Like, a teacher can't slap a kid in the face in the United States, but that happens in Nepal if you speak back, right? But in the orphanage that he was at, there were these girls from France, and they were going out and getting wasted and meeting guys and smoking and coming back to the orphanage and, you know, being hungover and, you know, going out French girl going out clubbing clothing in a very conservative culture, right? And so that was one of his wake-up bells as well. It's like, wait a second, like, that shouldn't be okay, right? Like, you shouldn't be able to come back to the orphanage drunk and like stumble into your room and like smoke cigarettes outside that these kids are looking at. And that's another way, I think, too, that a lot of people, you know, they don't have that like cultural transitional lens of things that might be appropriate here, you know, physical contact with the same sex or the opposite sex, or how you're dressing. And even something like, you know, in some cultures, like showing your shoulder is very taboo. In the United States and the UK, it's not, but in some, showing your shoulders is basically equivalent of like showing your boobs in public, right? But then these people are going out and doing these things, and these kids are saying like, oh, this is what's cool to do. You know, it's totally acceptable to go out and hook up with strangers and to drink alcohol and to smoke cigarettes. And, you know, these people are successful, so why can't I do those things too? And then I can also be successful. And countries like Nepal and India, you know, drinking alcohol, although it is legal, it is very frowned upon. And especially in like the smaller villages where a lot of these kids come from, it's kind of like the equivalent of like smoking crack here. Like, yeah, there's that one guy who does it who's, you know, completely out of it, but no one in the village does, and everyone knows it's not something you do.
You mentioned in a previous section about a dancing troupe, right? You know, and it just made me think of a particular case. Obviously, I won't name it, but it's quite a high-profile organization that I've seen at events, and it's exactly that, right? It's a significant size organization, and I don't want to cast too much shade on them, but they have some of these kids are young, 7, 8 years old. Some of them go up to late teens, and they tour Europe and America, where there's lots of well-meaning middle-class people, and they perform. They perform shows. They're incredibly talented. They're incredibly well choreographed and produced. And it has some fantastic people working for it. And I'm sure they think they're doing the right thing by giving the children an opportunity to travel and do all of these things and experience new cultures. But really, for me, it feels wrong, and it feels exploitative. And I'm sure, as wonderful as these experiences might be for the children on the dance troupe, there are better places for kids of that age in better situations. And
you're talking about, I think it's bigger in Europe than it is here, because I've heard conversations with some experts who seem to share your opinions on this. I don't know, and so I do think at this point I've kind of become an expert in this subject as far as orphanage tourism and child trafficking. And my voice seems to carry some weight when I talk to kind of major organizations or people who are interested in this. So I try to be very careful about this stuff I'm not really sure about. So the same, I don't talk about adoptions very much because that's not where my expertise is. I will say that, I'm always a little worried when I see stuff like that could be exploitative. In the cases of Nepal, I know often these children are more induced to do it. It's like, if you don't do it, maybe you don't get the same benefits that the other kids who do it as, and the favoritism. And, at the end of the day, these children are human beings, right? And they're going to try and do what they think is best for them. But yeah, I have seen that. It is something that I think definitely warrants some more questions and some more studies, kind of similar to the orphanage tourism thing. There seems to be a very large movement saying, oh, this is so great, it provides a lot of opportunities. But there also seems to be some negative things I've heard about it. But yeah, as far as what that's concerned, I don't have a strong enough opinion yet on this to comment and give a sort of direction to it.
It's one of those things, though, isn't it? It's like, how far back do we go? So, okay, it's a great, effective fundraiser. Okay, great. Where's the money going? Well, it's going to effectively a very large organisation or institute that looks after homeless or street children. Well, you've already said at the outset, actually 80% of those classified as orphans or occupying orphanages actually have a living parent. So, what's happened there, and can that money not be distributed in a more effective way to work in a community level, to work with families, to look at inequality, to look at all of the different reasons why somebody might offer their child to an institution for better care? No, we're just focused on raising money. It's like, oh no, I haven't got time to go that far back, to actually just peel a couple of steps back in the process and look at the bigger picture and figure out what needs to be solved here, rather than, well, let's just keep it at this level, keep the machine churning, and we'll continue to work on the symptoms rather than the cause.
It's a very difficult thing as a filmmaker and as someone working in the space, and you probably run into the same thing. And going back to this, being survivor oriented or victim oriented is a sort of sensationalizing of the issue. And it's something I've run into personally, where people say, oh, you're sensationalizing, and people should care even if you don't sensationalize, right? If you don't talk about, and it was very difficult for us because we left out of the documentary a lot of the worst stuff, like the child abuse, the kids being sold. We barely talk about it, the sex abuse and the sex trafficking. And the reason we took that out, because we encountered it, was that people would say, oh, these kids who were just in the orphanage and just beaten a little bit, they were fine. That's way better than the girl who got sold off to sex slavery, or the kid who got sold off to working in a kitchen. So we took that out. But at the same time, we do kind of sensationalize, or we try to bring attention to this bad stuff that is going on. And people will say, well, can't you make people care without that? Because people should care. This should come to people's attention. And, sadly, the answer is no. I thought, I can't believe I'm working on this documentary, and I have been for over 10 years. I was naive, and I was like, I'm going to release this film, and no one's going to have heard about it before, and everyone's going to go, oh my God, we've got to stop this tomorrow. And, the general response is oh yeah, that sucks. A lot of bad things in the world. I'm really concerned about this thing. And even in the human trafficking circles, there's so many different forms of human trafficking, where I've gone and I've tried to build consensus and work with other nonprofits working in human trafficking, and they'll say like, oh, we only work in human trafficking for young men who are trafficked into migrant labor and farm labor, and we don't want to take any other views. There's already enough people paying attention to the sex trafficking and the child trafficking. And it's like, in some way, you're competing not only with the traffickers and the people who are doing bad, but all of the other people who are trying to do good and bring attention to their issue. And, that's very hard to do, and you have to kind of stand out in some way in order to get people to start to think about or to care about this issue. And it is very difficult, and it is like a line to walk, and we've tried to, make sure that everyone, like, isn't portrayed poorly as this poor victim who has nothing to do, that they are individuals, that they have goals and families. But as a filmmaker and as someone who's trying to work to help the vulnerable, it is very difficult to show something that it's dramatic enough that people care enough to want to do something, like pass legislation in the United States or change their behavior, but at the same time not turn it into like victim porn.
Yeah. So ending in a hopeful place. Like I said at the start, let's bookend this with coffee and hope. Tell me what has been achieved and signs of potentially even greater influence that's come as a consequence of you and your buddy hopping on Royal Enfields and going for a spin.
So the things that have already been done is we've passed proclamations in 2 cities in California, which are the first of their kind. And we've started working with international organizations, some in Ireland, some in France, to potentially use the film as an educational platform. I believe it was recently screened in Africa for around 40 volunteers for them to help understand kind of the issues and the awareness, and we're working on that. On the really much more exciting part, we've been working with Chris Smith's office, which is a congressman out of New Jersey. He did the legislation behind International Megan's Law, and he's really interested in this. His office has been great in saying and starting to see that, okay, this is something that isn't covered. This is something that we should bring attention to. And so we may be able to get some legislative action through that way. I've also been talking to a California Assembly member, Gail Pellerin, and I will be having a meeting with her in early August to see if we can address this in the California-based side, which I must say is super exciting. It's really great to see that we may actually lead to legislative change. And this would be the first sort of legislation of its kind in the world from these donor-sending, money-sending countries. A lot of countries already have rules on the book. Kenya, for example, is trying to reintegrate all kids into family-based care and kinship-based care and out of orphanages. But from the money-sending side, to start to put regulations on this is really exciting. And I'm happy to work with other people in other countries and other organizations showing, here's what I've done here, here's kind of my points that I think we can get everyone to agree with, and trying to move forward. So that's been super hopeful and really exciting. And if someone wants to watch the film, so our website, volunteersneededthefilm.com, the film is not publicly available, and it can't be until we kind of find a distributor. And part of that is if we put it on YouTube so anyone can watch it, it'll never be on Netflix, it'll never be on HBO, it'll never be on Amazon Prime. So it's currently only available at private screenings and it's password protected. But I'm happy to work with organizations like I did in Africa, where I'll set up a private screening for a group where they can watch the film. I've zoomed into some of these where people can ask questions and we can do a panel. And so if you're saying, hey, I'm really interested in this, I have an organization in the US or the UK or somewhere else that would like to learn more about this issue and potentially contribute or work towards stopping it, you can send me an email. My email's on the website, and I'm happy to pretty much work with anybody to help protect vulnerable kids.
I want to send you out with the opportunity. Like, what can we do to get behind you? Like, you've got real momentum behind you. You're fantastically articulate on this subject matter, and like, what can we do to support you from here out?
So there's a few things, obviously. The first is, financial. We want to take the film more places, and right now, everything comes out of pocket. So the microphone I bought so I can talk to you on the podcast, our cameras, all the gas money to drive to every Rotary meeting, and I have to buy plane tickets to go to Washington, D.C., that all comes out of my personal money. And so what we're thinking of doing, we haven't done it yet, is establishing a way for people to donate on the website and then even have them bookmark that so they can say, hey, I really want to see, and we've had requests that could we translate the subtitles to French? And I don't speak French, so I'm going to have to hire someone, and this will cost thousands of dollars. But if someone could say, hey, here's $2,000, get subtitles in French, we can get the film out to more people and have a larger transition. The other one is, you can talk about this issue with others. Pretty much everyone I know is like 2 steps away from someone who donated or volunteered in an orphanage. Like if you didn't do it personally, you probably have a cousin or your cousin's friend who did. And by talking about this issue and getting them to start to think about it is great. Sharing our website, our Facebook, our Instagram, so this becomes an issue. And then finally, write or contact the people who can make change. So if you're in the UK, you can write your parliament member. If you're part of a group, in the US, we have the Rotary. I'm assuming you have it there as well, or like Kiwanis clubs. You could set up this training. If you said, hey, I really care about this issue. I wasn't aware there was a movement for it. And if you got, backers, we could start to make this a movement. There already is some people working on this in the UK and in other countries. But we could help get this movement going farther and going faster. And what I'm hoping is that as the United States gets legislation or California gets legislation, other countries can say, wow, look at that language, that's done well, and it is controversial to say, let's shut down all the orphanages, or, let's not allow this or that, but to say, let's set some minimum standards that anybody who is interacting with these vulnerable children, where they're the protectors and it's not the state, there's some sort of regulation so we're not inadvertently funding human trafficking in the more severe ways.
I think it's a really, really helpful subject to discuss, and I'm so grateful for you coming on, mate, and talking about it so clearly. More power to your arm. I'll be watching your campaign, and however I can support, I'm keen to. So, hey, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
A life disrupted by encountering injustice on a motorcycle tour of Nepal. And now look what's happened. Barak is an example of one of the few people who have resisted the urge to look the other way and tender out generous helpings of the benefit of the doubt to some suspicious circumstances that one may encounter when they travel the world. There's a dilemma, isn't there? Do you stop and start to ask questions, or ride on, untroubled, into the sunset? Right, orphanage adventure done, let's go rescue some turtles. We've brushed on this subject before. I remember Krish Kandaya, who we interviewed on a previous episode, saying to us, some orphanages are better than others, but there's no such thing as a good one. He strongly advocated for the reintegration of children into a family setting, be that a living family member, foster carer, or adoptive parent. I do think it's important to remind people that there are shelters and programs that look after children with complex needs, some of whom are orphaned, abandoned, or have experienced serious childhood trauma, often from a parent or guardian, and these places do an excellent job at providing a safe, loving, and supportive setting. You may remember an interview we did with Claire in the episode Trafficked at 19, a survivor's story. Claire told us that she went through over 30 foster carers before ending up at a children's unit where she felt safest and was able to get on with completing her GCSEs and A-levels. I actually met a girl recently who came on a barista training course at our coffee shop who had a very similar story and was living at a centre for young people. Only we don't call these places orphanages anymore. At least in the UK we don't. I like that Barak allows for nuance. He's asking for greater scrutiny and regulation of any organisation welcoming in volunteers to care for children. And I would 100% support that. Do children thrive better in a loving family setting? Of course they do. Is there a shortage of foster carers and adoptive families? You bet there is. The UK has more children living in care now than at any time before. 107,000 at the latest count. So it's two-sided, isn't it? You can't do one without the other. You can't go around shutting children's centres unless you are growing reintegrative care solutions. And I would love to see those two things progress together in tandem. Hey, if you have a teenager who's thinking about doing a gap year, maybe send them this episode. Get them to do some thinking around their voluntourism plans and how perhaps they ought to consider the unintended impact of their efforts to give back. I'll put a link to the books mentioned in the interview in our show notes, as well as a link to Barak's website, volunteersneededthefilm.com. This podcast was produced by Blue Bear Coffee Co. Come and see who we are and what we do by visiting bluebearcoffee.com, or follow us on social media at Blue Bear Coffee Co. or me at Bryn Smith. I would love to hear your thoughts about this podcast, so drop me a message and have a wonderful day. Peace.